In the hedgerow country of Normandy, June 1944, a young American tank commander named Lieutenant Bill Lovelady peered through the narrow vision slit of his M4 Sherman and saw something that made his stomach drop. Across a field of wheat stubble, partially concealed behind an earthen berm, sat a German Panther tank. Its long 75mm gun was already traversing toward him. Lovelady had perhaps 3 seconds to live. The mathematics of the encounter were brutal and simple. The Panther's frontal armor was 80mm thick, sloped at 55 degrees, effectively making it over 140mm against a direct hit. Lovelady's 75mm M3 gun, firing standard armor-piercing rounds, could penetrate about 90mm at 500 yards under ideal conditions. The Panther, meanwhile, could punch through the Sherman's frontal armor barely 50mm from over a mile away. In a straight fight, at any range, the Sherman lost. American tankers had a dark joke. It took 5 Shermans to kill one Panther 1 to draw fire while the other 4 tried to flank. The joke was only funny because it was grimly accurate. But Lovelady did not die that afternoon. Instead, he did something the German crew did not expect. He didn't reverse, didn't try to engage, didn't freeze. He popped smoke-white phosphorus grenades mounted on the Sherman's hull, detonating in a chain, throwing up an instant chemical fog that swallowed his tank like a magician's curtain. Within seconds, his driver was reversing hard, the engine screaming, while Lovelady barked coordinates over the radio. The Panther fired blind into the smoke. The round shrieked overhead. By the time the fog began to drift, the Sherman was gone, repositioned, and calling in artillery. The Panther, magnificent and deadly, was forced to displace or risk getting bracketed by high explosive shells it couldn't see coming. This was not how tank warfare was supposed to work. The textbooks, the training manuals, the pre-war doctrines all assumed that armor fought armor in clean exchanges of fire, where the better gun and thicker plate won. But Normandy was not a textbook. The hedgerows, the narrow lanes, the close terrain, all of it negated the Panther's advantages and forced a different kind of fight. And the Americans, outgunned and out-armored, adapted with a speed and creativity that turned their technical inferiority into a tactical laboratory. Smoke became their equalizer. It's a story that cuts against the dominant narrative of American armor in World War II, that narrative shaped by memoirs and films, and the stark kill-loss ratios tends to frame the Sherman as a death trap and its crews as brave but doomed, grinding toward victory through sheer numbers while German supertanks ruled the battlefield. There's truth in that narrative. Sherman crews did suffer, and the Panther was a formidable machine, but it's incomplete. It misses the improvisation, the tactical evolution, the unglamorous little innovations that allowed American units to not just survive, but prevail against technically superior opponents. Smoke was one of those innovations. Not smoke as concealment in the general sense armies had used smoke for centuries, but smoke as a deliberate, integrated tactical system that turned the Sherman's weaknesses into a kind of advantage. American tank doctrine evolved to treat every engagement not as a duel, but as a problem to be solved through movement, coordination, and creating just enough chaos to shift the odds. Smoke was the catalyst for that chaos. To understand how this worked and why it mattered, we have to go back to the beginning, to the moment American armor first met German heavy tanks in North Africa, and the hard lessons learned in the killing fields of France. We have to look at the Panther itself. What made it so dangerous, why the Germans built it, and what its presence on the battlefield forced the Americans to reckon with. And we have to examine the evolution of American combined arms tactics, the role of terrain, and the unglamorous reality that wars are often won not by the best technology, but by the side that adapts fastest when the plan falls apart. The Panther entered service in mid-1943, a direct response to the T-34 shock the Germans experienced on the Eastern Front. The Panzer divisions in 1941, combining sloped armor, a powerful gun, and wide tracks that handled mud and snow better than anything the Wehrmacht fielded. The Panther was Germany's answer, a medium tank with heavy armor protection, a high-velocity gun adapted from the feared 88mm flak cannon and excellent optics. It weighed 45 tons, could hit 30 miles per hour on roads, and when it worked, it was arguably the best tank of the war. But the Panther had problems. Its Maybach engine was temperamental and prone to catching fire. Its final drive and transmission were under-engineered for the tank's weight and broke down frequently. Early models suffered mechanical failures at catastrophic rates. During the Battle of Kursk, more Panthers were lost to breakdowns than to enemy fire. By the time the Allies landed in Normandy, many of these issues had been addressed. But the Panther remained a maintenance-intensive beast that required supply lines, spare parts, and time luxuries the Germans had less of with each passing month. Still, when it was operational and well-positioned, the Panther was a nightmare. Its gun could engage Allied tanks at ranges where return fire was ineffective. Its armor could shrug off hits that would gut a Sherman. And its crews, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front, knew how to use terrain, how to position hull down, how to pick apart attacking formations. American tankers who faced Panthers for the first time described the experience as terrifying watching your rounds bounce off while the enemy methodically destroyed your platoon. The standard American response, at least initially, was to try to flank. Get around to the Panther's thinner side or rear armor, close the distance, and put around where it mattered. But flanking required space, time, and the enemy's cooperation. In the bocage, the dense hedgerow country of Normandy, there was no space. The fields were small, the lanes narrow, visibility limited to 100 yards or less. A Sherman trying to flank often found itself nose-to-nose with a Panther in a sunken road, or silhouetted against a gap in the hedge while the German tank sat hidden in shadow. The close terrain that was supposed to help the Americans actually played into German hands, allowing them to set ambushes and control engagement ranges. This was the problem Lieutenant Lovelady and thousands of tankers like him faced in the summer of 1944. They were driving machines that could win a fair fight, in terrain that made fair fights inevitable. Something had to change. The change didn't come from the Pentagon or the armored schools back in the States. It came from sergeants and lieutenants in muddy fields who realized that if they could outshoot the Panther, they had to stop trying. Instead, they had to outthink it, outmaneuver it, and crucially prevent it from taking the kind of clean, long-range shots where its superiority was absolute. Smoke became the central tool in that effort. American Shermans carried smoke grenades as part of their standard equipment, typically 6 M2 smoke pots mounted on the hull, electrically fired from inside the turret. White phosphorus created thick, fast-developing clouds that could screen a tank's movement within seconds. The British also used smoke extensively, and their tactics influenced American doctrine, but the U.S. armored divisions took it further, integrating smoke into nearly every tactical scenario. The basic principle was simple: if the Panther couldn't see you, it couldn't kill you. But the application required discipline and coordination. A lone Sherman popping smoke and reversing might survive, but it also gave up ground and initiative. The real power came when entire platoons or companies used smoke in concert, some tanks screening, others maneuvering, infantry advancing under the cover, artillery dropping smoke rounds to blind German positions further back. In practice, it looked something like this. A platoon of 4 Shermans approaches a village known to have Panther support. The lead tank spots movement, possibly a Panther hull down behind rubble. Instead of engaging, the lead tank immediately pops smoke and reverses while radioing the contact. The second and third tanks fan out to the flanks, also screening with smoke, creating a wall of white fog across the entire approach. Meanwhile, the platoon leader calls in artillery to drop smoke rounds on suspected German positions beyond the village, further degrading enemy observation. Under this layered screen, infantry dismounts and advances through the smoke, using it as concealment to get close to German positions. The tanks reposition, probing for angles, while mortar teams add more smoke to the mix. The Panther crew, sitting in what should be a dominant position, is now blind. They can hear engines, radios crackling, movement, but they can't acquire targets. If they fire into the smoke, they're guessing, wasting ammunition, and revealing their position with muzzle flash. If they displace to escape the smoke, they give up their prepared position and expose themselves to flanking fire. If they wait, the Americans close in with infantry carrying bazookas and satchel charges. This wasn't always elegant. Smoke drifted unpredictably, sometimes screening the Americans' own movements or giving away positions when it cleared too soon. Friendly fire incidents happened when units lost track of each other in the fog. But over time, through brutal trial and error, American armored and infantry units developed an instinctive feel for how to use smoke as a weapon, not just a defense. One of the most effective adaptations was the combination of smoke with movement and combined arms. American doctrine increasingly emphasized that tanks didn't fight alone, they worked with infantry, engineers, artillery, and air support in an integrated system. The Sherman's role in this system wasn't to duel Panthers. It was to suppress enemy positions, provide mobile firepower for infantry, and survive long enough to exploit opportunities when they appeared. Smoke made this survivability possible. A classic engagement might see American artillery laying down a smoke barrage on German positions while infantry advanced under the screen. Shermans, moving with the infantry, would use their own smoke to mask lateral movements, making it difficult for German anti-tank guns or Panthers to track individual targets. If a Panther revealed itself by firing, American tanks wouldn't necessarily return fire directly instead. They'd call in artillery or wait for infantry to work around the flank. The goal wasn't to destroy the Panther in a gunnery duel. It was to neutralize it, force it to reposition, or trap it in place until overwhelming force could be brought to bear. This approach frustrated German tankers, who were trained for mobile warfare and decisive engagements. Veterans of the Eastern Front, accustomed to sweeping maneuvers and tank-on-tank battles, found the American style maddening. An enemy that refused to fight properly, that hid in smoke and called down artillery, instead of accepting honorable combat. But there was nothing dishonorable about it. It was adaptation. It was using the tools at hand to offset a technological gap. The terrain of Northwest Europe reinforced these tactics. In the bocage, the small fields and high hedgerows made long-range engagements rare and ambushes common. Smoke allowed American units to disengage from bad positions and reset fights on their terms. In the forests of the Ardennes, during the Battle of the Bulge, smoke became even more critical as German armor enjoyed temporary superiority in numbers and position. American units, often surrounded or cut off, used smoke to break contact, screen withdrawals, and create enough confusion to delay German advances until reinforcements arrived. One documented example comes from the fighting around St. Vith in December 1944. A company of Shermans, vastly outnumbered by Panther and Tiger tanks from the SS Panzer divisions, found itself holding a critical crossroads. The American tankers knew they couldn't stop the German advance through firepower alone. Instead, they used smoke to simulate a larger force popping screens at multiple points, repositioning constantly, creating the impression of a coordinated defense in depth. The Germans, wary of ambushes and unsure of American strength, slowed their advance and called up infantry support. That delay just a few hours allowed American engineers to blow bridges and artillery to register defensive fires. The Shermans eventually withdrew, having lost several tanks, but they'd bought time. This kind of tactical deception, using smoke not just to hide but to mislead, became a recurring theme. American units learned that Panthers, for all their firepower, were cautious machines. They were too valuable to risk in hasty attacks, and their crews knew that mechanical breakdowns or track damage could turn a Panther into a 45-ton paperweight. Smoke exploited that caution. It forced German commanders to pause, to probe, to waste time trying to see through the fog, and time was the one resource Germany didn't have. But smoke alone wasn't enough. It had to be paired with other innovations, some technological, some tactical, some improvised in the field by soldiers who refused to accept that their equipment was simply inferior. One of those innovations was the development of better ammunition. The standard 75mm armor-piercing round carried by most Shermans in Normandy couldn't reliably penetrate a Panther's frontal armor. But in late 1944, American forces began receiving HVAP high-velocity armor-piercing rounds, which used a tungsten core and discarding sabot to achieve higher penetration. HVAP could punch through a Panther's front plate at closer ranges. Though the rounds were scarce and rationed carefully, crews hoarded them for critical engagements. More common was the use of high-explosive and white phosphorus rounds, not for armor penetration, but for suppression and psychological effect. A white phosphorus shell bursting on or near a Panther wouldn't kill it, but it would coat the tank in burning chemical fragments, obscure the crew's vision, and force them to button up or displace. It was harassment, not destruction, but it kept the Panther from doing its job, which was often enough. Another adaptation was the Rhine hedge cutter, a field modification developed by Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen during the Normandy breakout. Shermans had struggled to push through the thick bocage hedgerows, which were walls of earth and roots several feet high. Tanks trying to climb over them exposed their thin belly armor to anti-tank fire. Cullen welded steel teeth cut from German beach obstacles onto the front of Shermans, allowing them to rip through hedgerows instead of climbing over them. This seemingly simple modification had profound tactical implications. It gave American armor mobility in terrain where they'd been channeled and ambushed. Combined with smoke, it allowed Shermans to appear and disappear unpredictably, making it much harder for German defenders to set up clean shots. The integration of tank destroyers also played a role. The M10 and later M36 tank destroyers carried more powerful guns. The M36 90mm could engage Panthers on more even terms but were lightly armored and vulnerable. American doctrine increasingly used tank destroyers in overwatch positions, covering Shermans as they maneuvered. Smoke would screen the Sherman's advance. If a Panther engaged, it would ideally expose itself to the tank destroyer's heavier gun. It wasn't always clean, and it required radio coordination that didn't always work, but when it did, it turned the Americans' numerical and organizational advantages into tactical leverage. Infantry support was perhaps the most critical element. American armored infantry teams became exceptionally good at close combat, particularly in urban and wooded terrain. Bazookas, satchel charges, and sticky bombs could kill a Panther if infantry could get close enough, and smoke gave them that chance. There are numerous accounts of American infantry sneaking through smoke-covered streets, getting within yards of German armor and disabling it with explosives. The Panther's powerful gun was useless at that range, and its crew, buttoned up inside, had limited visibility. This combined arms approach was not uniquely American. The Soviets practiced similar tactics, and the British were skilled at integrating armor, infantry, and artillery, but the Americans institutionalized it with remarkable speed. After action reports were systematically collected, lessons were disseminated through training bulletins, and successful tactics were spread across units. By late 1944, newly arrived American armored divisions were arriving in Europe with smoke-centric tactics already baked into their doctrine. The Germans, by contrast, struggled to adapt. Their tactical culture emphasized the superiority of their equipment and the skill of their crews. There was resistance to the idea that the enemy might be winning through tricks rather than strength. German after-action reports from the period sometimes read with a tone of frustration complaints that the Americans fought dishonorably, using smoke and artillery rather than meeting armor with armor. But war is not a duel, and the Americans understood that survival mattered more than style. Moreover, Germany's deteriorating strategic situation limited its ability to respond. Smoke tactics are most effective when you have reserves, mobility, and the ability to exploit the chaos you create. The Americans had all three. German units, increasingly short on fuel, ammunition, and replacements, often couldn't capitalize even when American smoke tactics failed. A Panther that successfully held a position against a smoke-screened attack might still be forced to withdraw hours later due to lack of fuel or encirclement by infantry that had bypassed it. By the time of the Rhine crossings in early 1945, American armored units were operating with a level of tactical sophistication that made Panther encounters manageable, if not easy. Smoke was now standard operating procedure. Crossing the Rhine at Remagen, American engineers laid smoke screens for hours, blinding German artillery observers and allowing armor to pour across the Ludendorff Bridge before it could be destroyed. Smoke covered the breakout from the bridgehead, the advance into the Ruhr, the exploitation across the plains of central Germany. German tankers, veterans of years of war, found themselves outmaneuvered by an enemy they'd been told was industrially strong but tactically clumsy. One captured Panther commander, interrogated in April 1945, expressed bewilderment. His tank had been technically superior in every way, he insisted. But he'd never been able to use that superiority, always the smoke, always the movement, always the sense that he was being pulled into a fight on the Americans' terms, not his own. There's a photograph from the Ruhr pocket, April 1945. It shows a Panther tank, intact but abandoned, sitting at a crossroads. Its gun is traversed to the side, as if caught mid-movement. There are no visible shell holes, no catastrophic damage. The crew simply left it out of fuel, out of ammunition, out of options. In the background, blurred by distance and the camera's shallow focus, American Shermans roll past. They don't stop to inspect the Panther. There's no need. The war has moved on. That image captures something essential about how the Americans won the armored war in Europe. It wasn't through building a better tank. The Pershing arrived too late and in too few numbers to matter. It wasn't through superior gunnery or thicker armor. It was through creating a system where the enemy's technical advantages became irrelevant. Smoke was a part of that system, but so was logistics, combined arms, adaptability, and sheer relentless pressure. The Panther was a magnificent machine, but it was also a product of a military culture that believed technology and individual skill could overcome systemic disadvantages. The Germans built fewer but better tanks, manned them with highly trained crews, and expected decisive results. When those results didn't materialize, when the enemy refused to fight, the kind of war where better tanks mattered, the entire edifice began to crack. The Americans, by contrast, accepted early on that the Sherman was good enough. Not great, not superior, but good enough to serve as a platform for a larger tactical system. They built tens of thousands of them, kept them supplied, and used them in ways that minimized their weaknesses and maximized their numbers. Smoke was one tool among many, but it symbolized the broader approach. Don't fight the enemy's fight. Create conditions where your strengths matter more than theirs. This doesn't mean American tankers didn't pay a price. They did. Sherman crews suffered horrific casualties in some engagements. Tanks brewed up, men burned, entire platoons were wiped out by well-positioned German armor. The kill ratios, particularly in Normandy, were lopsided. For every Panther destroyed, the Americans lost multiple Shermans. But they could afford those losses in a way Germany could not, and crucially, they learned from them. By war's end, the average American tank crew's life expectancy had improved significantly from the dark days of June 1944. Better tactics, better coordination, better use of terrain, and smoke all contributed to that improvement. The Panther remained dangerous until the last days, but it was no longer the death sentence it had seemed a year earlier. After the war, military analysts dissected the tank battles of Northwest Europe in exhaustive detail. Some argued the Americans should have fielded heavier tanks earlier. Others pointed to the logistical challenges. The Pershing was heavier, harder to transport, more fuel-hungry. The debate continues among historians, but the soldiers who fought don't tend to frame it that way. In their memoirs and interviews, they talk about what worked: movement, smoke, teamwork, and refusing to play by the enemy's rules. Lieutenant Lovelady survived the war. He returned home, became a teacher, and rarely spoke about his time in a Sherman. In one of the few interviews he gave, decades later, he was asked if he'd been afraid of the Panthers. He said yes, of course, only a fool wouldn't be. But fear didn't matter as much as training and trust in the men around him. And smoke, he added with a slight smile. Smoke mattered a lot. The broader lesson extends beyond tank warfare. In any contest where one side has a technical edge, the other side must innovate not just technologically but tactically and organizationally. The side that adapts fastest, that learns from failure, that refuses to accept the enemy's framework, that side often wins, even when the scoreboard suggests otherwise. The Panther was a better tank than the Sherman. That's not in question. But the Americans built a better system, and in war, systems matter more than single platforms. Smoke was a small part of that system, almost prosaic compared to the drama of armor clashing or the heroism of individual crews. But it was the unglamorous tools, the smoke grenades, the field modifications, the after-action reports, the tactical flexibility that turned American armor from outmatched to overwhelming. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Panther's reputation had shifted. It was no longer the invincible predator of 1944, but a symbol of a military that had confused technical excellence with strategic wisdom. The Americans, meanwhile, had proven that you don't need the best equipment, you need the best system, the best adaptability, and the willingness to fight smart when you can't fight strong. In the end, the smoke cleared. The Panthers sat silent, abandoned in fields and towns across Germany. The Shermans kept rolling because the side that kept moving, kept learning, kept adapting, that was the side that won. If this story of tactical innovation and adaptation resonates, subscribe. History isn't just about the big machines and famous battles. It's about the small decisions, the field expedients, and the soldiers who figured out how to survive and win against the odds.